It is so wonderful to see everyone here this morning. Glad to see folks, as we said during class, that don't get to see very often, and also those that we get to see all the time. Both are very welcome and always thankful that we can have each other as brothers and sisters in Christ to spend time with. I do want to go off of what Danny said for just a second in terms of something to look forward to in the next year. As I think we all remember, I hope we all remember, now that we're at the end of the year, we read through the New Testament throughout the year 2023. We have had the what do you call it, the plans or whatever, the specific sections in the bulletin each week, and we've been doing that together. Well, that's the New Testament. We're going to attempt the Old Testament this coming year. So that will be in the bulletin. In fact, it's already in the bulletin for this next week, the first few chapters of Genesis that we'll be reading. But that will also be posted on Facebook, not the individual things, but the link to the program. If you want to do that, so it'll be in the bulletin, and the links will be posted here shortly as well. So I'll be starting it, and hopefully it'll be to where we can actually share with each other on that app that we use if you're interested in doing that. If not, you can just read along, of course. But that should be posted by tomorrow for sure, because it will start tomorrow. So I hope that you will join us for that as we're reading through. I know that I've probably read every part of the New Testament, or the Old Testament at some point. I don't think I've ever read it all together in one section in the way that we're going to be doing, so that will be a good thing. It's funny, though, that we're talking about resolutions, because that's kind of a thing during this time of the year, isn't it? A lot of gyms are going to be very full for the next week, right? A lot of notes are going to be made, a lot of plans are going to be written out, a lot of things are going to be done in preparation for this new year. And by about January 15th, how many are going to continue? That's always the joke, right? We always make these New Year's resolutions, and then, they just kind of fade out, and real life sets in, and our lovely idealistic thoughts about what we can accomplish just kind of give way to the harsh reality that I don't feel like doing what I wanted to do. Now that's part of life in a sense, I guess. There's nothing wrong with setting some kind of resolution for something and then realizing you have to adjust. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but there are some resolutions, not just New Year's resolutions, quote unquote, but there's some resolutions we make that we need to keep. For example, there's a reason why we're all here this morning, isn't there? I hope that all of us are here because we are resolved to follow God. We even sing songs like, I am resolved, no longer to linger charmed by the world's delights. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, they have allured my sight. Those aren't resolutions we want to allow to fail. And so I want us to talk this morning, while this could apply to resolutions like going to the gym more or this or that or the other, I want us to specifically think about our spiritual resolutions when we talk this morning about why resolutions fail. Why do our attempts to start a new program, start a new habit, start a new course of life in one area or another, why do they so often fail? And while, again, that's not maybe that big of a deal in certain areas, how can we make sure they don't in the areas that matter most? There's a reason why we have the word resolution in the first place, isn't there? As cheesy as it kind of is, I've got to admit, if anyone's ever seen the movie National Treasure, there's that line in the first clue that he has to come up with about a resolute pen, right? And they're thinking about this idea, okay, resolute pen or something like that. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And they realize, they wrote this, iron pen, actually. Resolute, this idea of, it was an iron pen, like literally made of iron. No, it's like iron, like resolute. They had this resolution. They wrote the Declaration of Independence. That's what the map's on. And then the whole movie starts off, right? But there's a reason why we have this idea of resolved, resolute. It's because a resolution is something that is supposed to be met with resolve. It's something that's supposed to be met with tenacity. It's something that's supposed to be approached with confidence, with determination. And yet again, so often they fail. Why do they so often fail? There's probably many reasons. But we're going to look at 3 this morning because 3 is the biblical number for a sermon points to have, right? Why do resolutions fail? Resolutions fail because we don't have a plan. There are some things you don't have to have a plan for, right? When I get up in the morning, I don't necessarily have to have a plan for how I'm going to put my breakfast together. Usually because I don't eat breakfast anyway, but that's a whole other story, right? But let's say I'm about to pour myself a bowl of cereal. I don't plan out ahead of time. I'm going to walk over to the cabinet, open the door, pull out the drawer, take out the box of cereal, open it, you get the point, right? I don't have to plan all that out. It just comes naturally. But that's because, number one, I want the cereal, and so it's not hard to follow through. And number two, it's not that complicated. It's not that big of a deal. It just becomes rote. It just becomes normal. It just becomes natural muscle memory. Don't even think about it. But as we think about not only resolutions we might make as far as New Year's resolutions, but specifically resolutions we might make in our efforts to be better servants of Christ, there's a difference, isn't there? How many of Jesus' sayings in the Gospels make sense at face value? Do you understand what we're asking here? When Jesus says, whoever saves his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will save it, does that make sense? I'm not asking, do we know what he's saying? I'm saying, at face value, is that logical? Is that natural? No, it's a paradox, and it's meant to be a paradox. And most of what Jesus said is like that. In fact, many have described the church and Jesus' ministry as being upside down. Everything about what Jesus taught seems to be the complete opposite of what we would think as human beings. So when it comes to resolutions that involve us trying to be better Christians, it's not going to be very straightforward now, is it? It's not going to come naturally because everything about following Christ is the opposite of our normal inclination as human beings. I don't want to sacrifice. I want to focus on me. I don't want to have someone else telling me what I need to do. I want to tell myself what I need to do. I don't want to put others above myself. I want to put myself above others. Those are our instincts. I don't want to turn the other cheek. I want to smash in the cheek of the person who just insulted me. So if it's that unnatural to us, and it is, as much as we might try and convince ourselves that it's not, well, then we're not going to succeed in our efforts if we don't put a little bit of preparation into it. If we don't know what we're trying to do, if we don't have a plan. How many contractors do you think go out and put a house together? No blueprints, no nothing. They just go out, hey, okay, we're going to put this wood here, we're going to put this here, and put the tiles up here, and just do it all. You think anybody does that? Unless you're building a ramshackle shed to put like a wheelbarrow and a couple of rakes in, I don't think that you're going to approach something like that without a plan. And yet sometimes we approach our Christianity in just that way. Specific areas of our Christianity. Now, I say all this with a lot of experience. I feel like I'm the world's worst at not planning how I'm going to accomplish something and just trying to, I guess some might describe it as white knuckle it, right? I'm just going to go on drive alone and I'm going to have a better prayer life. I'm just going to go on drive alone, on resolution alone, and I'm going to spend more time in my Bible. I'm just going to go on pure adrenaline, and I'm going to XYZ, whatever it is that I want to grow in. That's usually my mindset. And you know why those attempts haven't worked? Because it takes more than that. Remember what James says in James chapter 4. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Now we read this and we might say, well, hold on, it sounds like James is saying we shouldn't make plans. But that's not the point, is it? What kind of plans is James talking about? He's not talking about our efforts to try and become better Christians, now is he? He's saying we should recognize that all of our plans fall under the purview of God's sovereignty, which means I don't get to do anything unless God allows it to be so. And sometimes, even in our efforts to become better Christians, our plans might change. I think, for example, and I've told you all this story before, about my life between college and here. I was going to be in business. I was going to be in management somewhere, project manager, something, I don't know. And over the course of many very unexpected events, I ended up in preaching school instead. And now I'm here. And it's a much better path than I ever expected. It wasn't something that I initially planned on. But once it happened, I was able to begin putting everything into place. And it worked out. Notice what Solomon says in Proverbs 21. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. Plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. I'm sure we're all familiar with the ideas, at least, if we haven't looked into them, of people like Dave Ramsey and planning out money, right? Now, there's some things I agree with Dave Ramsey on. There's some things I don't, just from, my own background and so forth. But one thing that he doesn't have a monopoly on, but he certainly has emphasized, is the idea of planning out how you use your money. Whenever I was in college, I didn't have much money to plan with, but nonetheless, I didn't plan with what I did have. Whenever I was in college, whatever petty cash that I had at my disposal usually went to Taco Bell or Domino's. You can ask Connor, there were a lot of times that I had a couple of Domino's pizzas for lunch. But as I got older, I began to realize if I don't start planning my finances out a little more and saying this needs to be set aside for this and this needs to be set aside for this, I'm going to come to poverty real quickly, right? You got to have plans or else it's all going to fall apart. And we understand that with things like money and finances. But how often do we have zero plans when it comes to how we are going to grow spiritually? Oh, we want to grow spiritually. We intend to grow spiritually. But do we have any idea how we're going to do it? Do we have any steps in mind? Do we have anything that we're going to hold ourselves to? Or do we just expect it to happen because we want it to? If that's not going to work in any other area of life, why would we expect that to work with our faith? Which of you, Jesus asks, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost? He also used the example of the general going out to fight in a battle and trying to figure out, do I have enough men to beat this army? Now, in both of these scenarios, he's referring to becoming a Christian in the first place. But does the principle really stop there? Or do we have to sit down and figure out, this is where I am in my spiritual life. These are things that I'm doing well in and improving in. These are areas I need to work on. Now let me figure out how to make progress. We're never going to be perfect, which means we always have growing to do. But how much time do we actually spend planning out in some way? It doesn't have to be meticulous, but planning out how we're going to grow. If we don't do any planning, it's probably not going to happen. A goal without a plan is like a nail without a hammer. Oh, you've got the nail, it needs to go where it needs to go, but you don't have any way of getting it from point A to point B. It's probably not going to be where it needs to be. But secondly, why do resolutions fail? A lot of times it's because we run out of steam. We use that phrase, I believe, because of steam power. We're probably familiar with that. Whenever you would have trains first invented, they wouldn't run off electricity or anything like that. You'd essentially build up pressure inside a boiler, I think it would be called. You build up pressure in there by heating water and letting that steam build up, and then that pressure ultimately would be released in order to turn the pistons and allow the train to move along the track. What happens when the fire goes out, the water stops boiling? Well, you don't have any steam, so you don't have any pressure, so you don't move. You ran out of steam. Now, we just said it takes more than just willpower to accomplish our resolution. But it does take willpower to accomplish our resolutions. You got to have the plan, but you also got to have the determination to follow through on the plan. And it's too easy. We all know this. It's too easy to just give up, to just let it go. In Romans chapter 12, Paul says, "Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer." All of those statements, all of those character traits, they're not things that just happen. And I don't mean just happen without a plan, although you could throw that in there too. I mean, those aren't things that we just are born with. We're not just born being constant in prayer. We're not just born being patient in tribulation. We're not just born zealous and fervent in spirit. All of those things are choices we make. And that's really what all of this comes down to, isn't it? When we talk about running out of steam, what are we talking about? Why do you run out of steam? Well, you stop putting the wood in the fire to heat the water to create the steam. You make a choice to stop putting in the effort. And yet, again, it's so easy to do. Usually, we stop putting in the effort, we run out of steam because we end up diverting our effort to other areas, right? Instead of feeding the fire under the boiler, we start feeding the fire that keeps us warm and a little more comfortable. Or we start feeding the fire to cook ourselves a nice meal, but what's more important? It's not to say that there shouldn't be some effort put into other areas of our life, as we've talked about many times. We still have to put forth effort in many areas of life. But we have a choice to make. I've told you all before, this is one of my favorite verses, if not my favorite verse in the whole Bible. If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. This would make a lot more sense, going back to things kind of being upside down in Scripture. So make a lot more sense if he said, if you faint when things aren't that hard, your strength is small, right? But this doesn't make as much sense. When things get tough, isn't that the perfect time to be like, I don't know if I can do it anymore? Isn't that the perfect time to say, I actually have a legitimate excuse. This is hard. But Solomon says no. If you faint when things get hard, if you run out of steam when things are the hardest, that really says something about you. Essentially, if we want to maybe modernize the term with one of our own proverbs, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? That's when you really see who has the grit, who has the willpower to keep going. That's not to say we don't need help. That's not to say we can do it on our own. That's not to say we're completely self-sufficient or that we don't need to recognize when God is the only one who can bring us through something. That means whatever our part is to play, we don't give up. That means, as I've told some of my friends before, if you don't give up, you haven't lost. Remember the parable of the sower. One of the seeds in particular, or one of the soils rather, is described this way, of course representing a type of heart. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. In other words, they sign up to serve Christ. They sign up for the Lord's army at first, when it's easy, when there's no major obstacles. But when it gets hard, they run out of steam. Now, there's a lot of things that we can give up on in life, and it's not going to have a huge effect. I tried to play a game the other day that Connor wanted me to try out. And no offense to him, it wasn't my kind of game, and I gave up. Not really any consequences for that, right? Besides Connor being a little annoyed at me. Not really. But there's things like that we can give up on. It's not that big a deal. But what happens when we run out of steam when we're trying to follow Christ? That's a little more serious, isn't it? Even the best plans, as we just talked about, we got to have a plan. But even the best plans can't succeed if we give up on them. And I don't care what else we might give up on in this world. There's one thing we can't give up on. And that's serving our Lord. But thirdly, why do resolutions fail? Maybe because we don't have a plan going into it. Maybe because we run out of steam. Or maybe because we ignore the stakes. Now, what do we mean by that? Maybe because we ignore the stakes of not following through. What happens if you don't follow through on your resolution to go to the gym more often? Maybe you keep this on for a little longer, right? Maybe eventually there's some other consequences, health issues, whatever, but what happens when you don't follow through on other resolutions? What happens when you plan to do something and then you give up, not just because you run out of steam, but because you forget why it's so important? We mentioned this morning in class how other people suffer when someone makes a decision to drink and drive, for example. Why did they make that decision? Probably because they ignored the stakes. They didn't fully take in just how much this could hurt not only them, but those around them. What happens if we fail in our resolution to Christ? That's the last thing Satan wants us to be thinking about, right? When we're thinking about our efforts to grow, when we're thinking about our efforts to be better Christians, the last thing that Satan wants us to think about is what happens if we don't follow through. He wants us to be thinking about all the ways that this is hard. He wants me thinking about all the ways that we really can't be expected to follow through this much, to do this thing, to do that thing. That can't be what Jesus is actually expecting of us. That's what Satan wants us to think about. He doesn't want us to think about an eternity separated from God. He doesn't want us to think about the influence that our lack of faith can have on those around us, even if we never see it. He wants us to ignore the stakes. In all toil there is profit, Solomon said, but mere talk leads only to poverty. Again, in every aspect of life, there are stakes. It's part of what Solomon's saying here. There's stakes in every choice we make, but not all the stakes are the same. And yet, even in things that don't matter, we can train ourselves for the things that do. In all toil there is profit. I think about how many times my sticking with something that I have told myself I need to do has helped me. That one may not matter that much, but next time I have a bigger decision to make, the fact that I stuck with it over here helps me stick with it next time. I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Again, that seems strange. Why would you take away from the one who doesn't have and give to the one who already has? Well, he's not talking about money or something here. That's just the illustration that's used in the parable. What was it that the unfaithful servant didn't have? He didn't have the integrity. He didn't have the resolve. He forgot why he was in the position he was in. And therefore, he lost the opportunity. And the one who, yes, had shown themselves faithful with a lot, but it wasn't the lot that was important, it was the faithfulness, they received more opportunities. It's a rather ominous statement that Jesus makes in Revelation chapter 3. But these are the stakes. If you will not wake up, Jesus says, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. This church was dead. They were asleep. They had forgotten why it mattered. And Jesus reminds them of why it matters. This is the difference between life and death. This is the difference between eternity with Christ and eternity separated from Him. It's the difference between being part of those sealed people of God that we've been talking about in Revelation and being a part of the masses that are going to suffer judgment. If we fail to achieve our most important resolutions, we will not like the results. Again, as we talk about these things, there's a lot of resolutions we can make that don't have many stakes, that don't require a whole lot of planning, that don't really take a whole lot of willpower, and if we run out of steam, it's no big deal. I imagine, and this isn't necessarily that big a deal, I imagine most of us will probably make some resolutions for the new year that we won't follow through on. Now, just for the sake of our plans, I hope that's not the case, but it probably will be for some of us. I've done that many, many times, more than I care to admit. But when it comes to our resolution to serve God, not just in the next year, but for our lives, we can't let that fail. It's too important. It matters too much. The stakes are too high. So let's set our spiritual resolutions up for success. Maybe along the way we also set some other resolutions up for success as we think about some of these principles, but let's make sure when we made that commitment to God, whenever that was, if that was a few years ago or a few decades ago, let's make sure we're following through on that resolution. That we're not giving up. That we're not just trying to move forward without any kind of play, without any kind of focus. That we're not just expecting it to happen magically. Let's make sure that when we reach final judgment, and Jesus stands before us on the judgment seat, that we can say, I did what you asked me to do. And that He can say, well done, good and faithful servant. If there's anything we can help you with this morning, anything that we can encourage you with to help you in your resolve, we ask that you make it known, if not before us all, so we can all pray for you, then before one of the elders, approach them privately. Our goal is not to make something seen just for the sake of being seen. Our goal is to serve the one who sees all. If we can help you, please let us know as we stand and sing.
Almost persuaded now to believe, almost persuaded